because I know that not getting it over with isn't going to do any good. I know this is coming and this sucks. Like that's basically what it was.
My heart is racing for you, and I didn't have to make the call, right?
Yeah.
My heart is over here just racing.
So I call my mom, and I hadn't talked to her in a couple of years because as I got into adulthood, I started calling her out, not in a rude way, but very transparent ways where it's like, hey, this isn't normal.
Welcome to Unreasonable Autonomy. My name is Sarah Grace. This is the podcast for entrepreneurs and innovators who refuse to settle. Here we dive deep into raw, real conversations with boundary pushers who have pursued seemingly impossible ideas and yet have achieved unreasonable results, whether that's in their faith, relationships, health, politics, yes, even business. All of those conversations are happening right here, right now. So let's buckle up because this isn't about playing it safe. Unreasonable ideas, unstoppable results. Let's go. You guys, welcome back to the podcast. I am so thrilled to be sitting across from a dear friend of mine. You guys, Damon Burton. If you don't know Damon Burton, today is your day. Today is your day. And if you do know Damon Burton, you are here listening because you want to hear more and more and more from him. So a little backstory about Damon and I. We met at a soccer game here in Logan, Utah once and hung out for 15 minutes and
whoa, hold on there. There's more background to that.
Is there more background to this?
Why did we meet at a soccer game? Because we connected online.
That's true. That's true. So intrigued by how this human, this amazing Damon, was building a business without following any traffic strategy that I'd ever really seen anywhere. I was like, how are you getting clients? You're just writing stuff. What is going on? Right?
That's true.
That was kind of my first exposure to you. But I think something that has been so intriguing about your ability is when you meet Damon Burton, you're a little unassuming. Man, you're a little bit unassuming, right? You meet him and you don't realize that this guy is someone who is one of the most generous humans I've ever met. And I would say he's a new friend of mine, right? I would say you're a new friend of mine, but someone who has really made generosity a huge part of his path moving forward. And so I want to really dive into this conversation a lot about, did he grow up with generosity and did he grow up with these examples of selflessness and of really giving back and of really caring about being a parent and your influence on the world and in your home and what does a marriage look like? And that's really what I want to dive into. But I do think it's important for everybody to know Damon's got massive success under his belt. If you learn about his incredible company, you're going to hear that they've worked with the Utah Jazz Team Store, Shark Tank, Comcast, Charter, DirecTV, Dish Network, like a lot of these really, really household names. His SEO national company has just served and produced results over and over and over and over again, which has led to a lot of that incredible generosity and caring about being a parent and a husband and all those things in a beautiful way. So if you want to go check him out, go to damonburton.com. I have loved getting to know his company and his strategies, but more importantly, who he is as a person. So I'm excited to dive into what has created you into that. And we'll center a lot along how that started with you when you were really young. So welcome to the party, Damon. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm just as excited as you and the listeners are because half of this I don't think I consciously know either. And so we'll see what vomits out.
Deal. Well, can I just start with the elephant in the room, right? When I say that you are one of the most generous people that I have ever met, that is a true statement, right? That is a true statement. In the world of business, you're one of the most generous people that I have ever met. And were you shown that as a kid? Did you grow up in this generous, successful kind of household? And I'm being facetious here because I know the story a little bit, but introduce us to what you grew up with.
Yeah, so we'll table the answer for a minute and give a little bit of a background. So I'm the oldest of 7. I grew up, I generally categorize it as lower middle class. We always had a place, but it was never ours. So it was usually, whatever the next cheapest place we could rent, or half the time it was friends' basements, aunt and uncle's basements, things like that. So what's interesting, and the reason why I kind of laughed, but I was serious in the beginning about like I don't even know half of this stuff, is because you don't know any different when you're that age, and so it's just all normal. And so as you get older, you're like, oh, that's not normal. And then when what we'll talk about as we evolve, go through the evolution of my life, is then the other part that I'm still figuring out is the gap in between like where I'm at now, where I came from. And so because you're just living it day to day as you go and you're making incremental progress, and then all of a sudden, I've been self-employed for 17 years, like that's a big window. And so now it's like, whoa, I'm way over here now. And when did that happen? And so I can look back and I can remember, there was never there was never like a monumental shift in a brief period. And so it was all incremental things. And so it's like, I guess you'd compare it to like slowly boiling a frog, except for not negative and a positive, where it's like you don't recognize how monumental the changes are because they're so incremental. So never had disposable income and all those things. There's one part that I always kind of talk about where I can't take credit for it, or I can't put my finger on where I picked it up, and that's looking at these things as a positive. And so throughout all the things I went through, so it's like, never had roots, had an alcoholic stepdad, so there's the aggression, the violence with that, and then it's like I was always like, okay, well, don't do that. And so that's where it kind of comes in, and we'll talk about where it applies to family, because it's like, okay, well, if I want to have roots from my family, if you reverse engineer that, what's a core component of that? Oh, okay, financial stability. So don't mess up finances. And then like, okay, my mom was divorced and remarried 3 times. And so it's like, okay, well, what goes into, well, it's like patience and understanding and, finding the right person, and instead of making choices based on, needs. And so a lot of the things evolved from me just trying to reverse engineer the opposite of things.
So this is really fascinating to me, because it seems like that is not the common evolution. That we continue patterns, right? That we continue what we grew up with. And so do you feel like I was just born this way to kind of fight against, unhealthy patterns that I saw? Or what was it that got you into a space of evolution instead of I'm just going to repeat the alcoholism, and I'm going to repeat the abuse, and I'm going to repeat the financial instability? What's the difference there?
I'm still trying to figure it out, and I think I'm getting slightly closer. And I think it started when I was probably somewhere between the ages of like 8 and 10. And so that's when my mom divorced her second husband and then married her third, which would be the alcoholic that was in my life the majority of my childhood. And so when as I try to process things from back then, because in those moments you're just like, it's a combination of you don't know any different while also being in survival mode while not realizing you're in survival mode. And so now that you can look at that in retrospect and go, okay, what was really going on, and have like a broader view, that's when I think the seed was planted for constant proactiveness. And that has applied to my life in the personal scope and then also business. So like on the personal side, it's like, okay, is there anything I can do in the current environment and circumstances to minimize the probability of an alcoholic scenario? And so it's like things like, I don't know, I'm just making stuff up here. Is there anything I can do in the house?
Wow.
Do we need to be quiet? Like whatever, right? And so that constantness I wasn't aware of that was birthed until like in the last year or two. And then I've only realized that because I'm trying to reverse engineer many of these questions we're talking about and go, where did all this come from?
Yeah.
And why I found this answer or potential answer is because I was starting to try and understand the constantness in my life with always needing forward momentum. And so it's like with business, you need to be your biggest cheerleader. And so that's driven a lot of my success. But then within the last year or two, I'm like, do I have the bandwidth to maintain this level constantly? And it started to manifest physically. So mentally, I'm like, I can always do this. But then I'm like, okay, I'm in my 40s now. There's things that are, my body's going, hey, you might want to pay attention to this. And I'm like, nah, you're good. I'm still healthy, whatever.
Right.
And then it's like lots of little things. And so and when you're in entrepreneurship, I think when you're in it for a couple years, like, that's coming, and you're like, a lot of other people kind of sacrifice their health or something, right? Usually there's something you're sacrificed. And
Right.
so I knew it wasn't my relationship. My relationship was always good. I knew it wasn't this and that. And I wasn't completely negligent with my health. I was always aware of it, but there were certainly things I could have done better. And so those things start to compound to the point where I'm like, all right, maybe I need to actually consider if this is sustainable. And so as I started to pay attention to, is this sustainable? Is this sustainable? Then I went, where did this come from to begin with? And when I was able to go back, I think it pivoted from the childhood where it's like, okay, constant proactiveness to see if there's a way to maintain peace. But then as I became an adult and moved out, I already had this motion hardwired now. And so then I had to go, where do I direct this tension? Right. And so then as I got into entrepreneurship, then I think it clicked, and it's like, oh, I can be constantly proactive now in business. And so I didn't realize it at the time. And I think it just is something that became programmed and then has evolved over time.
Okay. I am diving into this word that you said, peace. Right? That a lot of your proactiveness in your home growing up was especially centered around, how do I increase peace, or how do we achieve peace, even though there's all these factors that I don't have a lot of control on? What can I control in order to create peace? And so do you think that there is a difference between being a peacemaker versus being a peacekeeper? And is there, like, at what point is it worth creating chaos or creating unpeacefulness or unrest, right? Like, have you confronted your mom about your childhood? Have you does that make sense? Like, that would be a source of like, this is not going to create more peace in the moment, right? But I'm going to confront it. But do you think there's a difference? And how do you know when to not keep the peace anymore and stand up?
Oh, so I have an answer, but I don't know if I feel like 50-50 on this. Like, I think I know 50% of the answer I can give you. And the other half is like, I don't know enough clarity on the distinction between peacemaker and peacekeeper to go, oh, I have a real clear thing that comes to mind.
Yeah.
But what does come to mind based on the example you gave is like, okay, to paraphrase what you said is, have I intentionally created chaos for the sake of, truth? Right.
Right. True.
And so, that way. And this is part of the journey where I started going down this, because about 2-3 years ago, like, I've always been very aware of what I grew up with. And then over time, I became more understanding of the scope of it, but it was never like a surprise. Like, I always knew I had going on. And so I always tried to be proactive around like not getting involved in it. But in the last 2 or 3 years, what happened was my mom just started to take up space in my head. Like, no clear memory, no specific memory, no specific moment, nothing. Like, I would just go to bed better. I'd wake up in the middle of the night better. I'd wake up in the morning better. And it was just cloudy, right? There was nothing specific. And so, being the type of person I am, I've always been proactive about the things or the problems in my life. And so I go, okay, let's identify it. And what does success or resolution look like? Okay, great. Now go do it. And I couldn't figure this out.
Yeah.
And so after dealing with it for a year or two, I'm like, okay, well, if I can't do it, let's find somebody that can help me with it. So I started searching things like high performance therapists and things like that. And I got super lucky. And like, I feel like therapy is like dating, where like you have to go on a couple of dates before you find the right therapist. And I got lucky. I found an awesome lady on the first time. And so she does these really deep dives. She only does 3-hour sessions. And so the first time I went in, it was just, here's all the background and here's what I'm looking to do. And then when I went in the second time, she got me over my mom, like, instantly. And so when I went into her, I told her the same thing. I'm like, here's where I'm at. Here's my background. And it's just starting to mentally wear me down, just the constant attention that it's getting in my head.
Yeah.
And so we got my mom out of my head with her and a combination of another coincidental thing I was doing. And what happened is I came to a moment where I was in this session where like I was trying everything. I can't remember the proper name of it, but there's like a therapy. I just call them the tappy doctors, like the tapping guys, where it's like
Tapping guys, okay.
so if you're not familiar with what this is, it's like you focus on a thing that you're trying to solve or a problem you're trying to identify. And then there's like certain touch points on your body through repetition. And I'm the people that do this, I apologize for slaughtering this, but like there's certain things there's a combination of thoughts and physical touch that can help your body reset ideas and programming. And so
Incredible.
I was in this moment where I was trying that. And I don't think, I know lots of people that have sworn by this tapping processes. It didn't do anything for me, but the combination of trying to focus on getting my mom out of my head while also doing the therapy stuff is I was sitting there in that moment and I went, oh, I got to get out of here because I'm just going to break down. And what was going on in my head was, how do I get my mom out of my head? And there's a thought that keeps coming to mind where it's like, you just have to call her. And the dialogue I was having in my head was on one side going, that's the only thing I can think of. And the other side going, no. And so like, these dialogues in my head are getting louder and louder and louder, and they're not going away. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to do this. And so in that moment, I'm like, I just need to get out of here and call her and get it over with. And so like I ended the session early. I'm like, I got to go, got out. And then I just called her.
Okay, wait, tell me like the 20 seconds before you called her. What is your brain doing?
Well, when I know the answer to something and I commit, I just have to get it over with because I know that not getting it over with isn't going to do any good. So it was, I know this is coming and this sucks. Like that's basically what it was.
My heart is racing for you, and I didn't have to make the call, right?
Yeah.
My heart is over here just racing. Okay.
So I call my mom, and I hadn't talked to her in. Why I should probably give some background on why I hadn't talked to her in the moment. So don't let me forget to come back to when I called her. So I hadn't talked to her in a couple of years because as I got into adulthood, I started calling her out, not in a rude way, but very transparent ways where it's like, hey, this isn't normal. Or because I'm the oldest of 7, I still had siblings that were repeating, going through all this stuff too. And it was only getting worse and worse and worse. And, we're in the family, we're like breeding victim mentality mindset. And like, I'll give you a perfect example is in 2016, I go through these waves of like wanting to do big charities. And I just finished one a couple of weeks ago where we did Christmas for 50 kids. And so we bought all Christmas presents for a bunch of underprivileged families. And so it's like, I go through these waves where it's like, I want to do something big, but I want to know the direct impact. And so in 2016, I was in one of those waves and I came to the idea of I was going to see what all the past due lunch balances were in the Title I, the low income schools in Davis County. So I grew up in Davis County. I was a beneficiary of free and reduced income lunches. And so I could identify with those kids. And so I had an assistant call all the schools in the county. They gave me the total past due balance. It was like $2,500. And so I just wrote a check to the county and paid it off. Now that ended up getting some news attention. And the person that was most offended was my mom. And she was offended because I didn't just give her the money. And that wasn't surprising. But what was surprising is that my 2 youngest brothers were too. And so this is what I talked about, breeding victim mentality mindset. And I'm like, well, why would they be offended? Because I helped other people. And by the way, who do you think's been paying for your Christmas the last couple of years? And so it's like, there's all these things that I'm giving and helping that don't need attention, but they all also don't deserve criticism. And so, well, I would call things out like that to my mom. And I'm like, why would my brothers be offended? Well, how would you feel if you saw your older sibling giving money to strangers? I'm like, what? It's like, I can't even wrap my head around giving a reply. So there's things like that would come up over the years. And then what happened was there was a Thanksgiving It's probably 6 or 7 years ago now, where I'd reached out a couple weeks in advance. Over the years, all the holidays have kind of migrated to our house because we have the more accommodating house with more space. And so I sent a message to my mom and all my brothers and sisters, and I said, hey, we're doing Thanksgiving again. If you can't make it, let me know and I'll drive to you. And they're like 90 minutes north. And so I said, I'll run up in the morning, hang out, and then come back and, do the thing in my house. And so nobody replied. Like, it showed acknowledgments and people had read it. So I'm like, well, whatever, they're busy. I'll follow up, the day before. So I followed up the day before and I said, hey, you guys are welcome to come down. And again, if not, like, I'll come see you for a little bit. No replies again. And so I'm like, whatever. So the next morning, it's Thanksgiving Day. And I'm doing household stuff and my wife's doing her thing. And all of a sudden she comes walking down the hallway and she's holding her phone and she's crying. And I go, what's going on? And she just points the phone to me to read. And it's a picture of my mom and all my brothers and sisters together. So here I am reaching out, trying to get a hold of everybody. Nobody replies. And then all of them get together. And so this is where this is what leads up to us not talking is I'm like, well, I'm going to call her, but I'm going to do it at the end of the day because it's not going to go well. So I might as well do Thanksgiving first and then call her. So I call her at the end of Thanksgiving and I say, what's going on? And she says, well, what do you mean what's going on? And I said, well, I've been texting you and everybody to try and get together. And her reply was, well, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. We've had this plan for a while. Like, that's exactly the deal. So not only did you get together, but you've also had it planned. And so then I just kind of unloaded on a bunch of things. And I'm like, look, here's all the things that don't make sense to me. Here's all the things that, you've made an impact on my life. Here's all the things how you're continuing to make an impact on our siblings' lives. And none of it was malicious, but it was all just very transparent. That being said, I also understand why it would hurt her feelings. And so she ended up, the last thing that she said before we fast forward and I called her was, one of the things I was talking to her about was, you never come to any of your grandkids' sports games. And so at the time, my kids were her only grandkids. She now has one other grandkid from my sister. But I said, I always send you the schedule. You never show up to any of them. It doesn't matter the season. It's soccer in the spring and fall, no show. Basketball in the winter, no show. Whatever, baseball in the summer, no show. And her excuse is, well, you don't understand how hard it is and this and that. And I'm like, my dad lives farther away than you, and he runs a business, and he does this, and he's at every game. And that's what I remember about my childhood too, is when they were divorced, my dad would be at every game. And so that evolved into her making a comment about, I don't understand, and gas money, and this and that. And I always offer gas money. And the last thing she said to me after the gas money comment is I went to say, you can't save $20. And I was going to say in a month, $20 in 1 month, but I knew that would be too unrealistic. So I paused and I said $20 in 3 months. And her reply was along the lines of, no, you don't get it because you're just a millionaire. Click. And she hung up on me. That was the last thing she ever said to me. It was a millionaire, and hung up on me. So then I went and bought millionaire.com. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I think I think it's going to be the name of my yacht. So, all right. So now fast forward to the call. So we hadn't talked since then. And I call her and I'm like, her phone's probably disconnected because it's always cheap, free plans, whatever. Sure enough, it's disconnected. I'm like, well, it's not going to get any better. So I text my sister and I go, give me mom's number. And so she texts me and I called her and she answered. And so I said, hey, I need a favor. And at this point, I just start bawling. And I'm like, I just need you to acknowledge that you've impacted my life. I don't even need you to apologize. I just need to acknowledge that the decisions that you've made have had an impact on my life. And then she goes, well, what? Like Rick, who's my stepdad? I said, yeah. And so she says, well, I can do that. And so when I call her, I'm going, this is either going to go really good or really bad. Yeah. But either way, it's going to be the answer. Because if it goes good, she's going to apologize. If it goes bad, it's just going to confirm that things are never going to change. And so it kind of came in somewhere in between where she acknowledged it, but without taking ownership for it.
Sure.
And so we had a short call. I said, thanks. And that was the end of it. We've sent one or two texts in the last year and a half, 2 years since then, but she's out of my head, and that's where we left it.
And why do you think that was the process to get her out of your head?
Well, the process that led to that, so she was mostly out of my head prior to that, but that needed to finish it, you know. But what the process was to get her out of my head was a process called EMDR. And the process that I went through is like so I was in the room with the therapist, and she says, you know, pick something in the room to represent your mom. And so I picked this red decorative vase thing. And she goes, I'm gonna set that over here out of view for a moment. And then she kind of changed topics. And then a couple of minutes later, just out of nowhere, she goes, all right, your mom's in the room, and like gestures towards the red thing. And so in that microsecond, I'm like, all right, I'm going to play all the way along and pretend that's my mom. And I just instantly got stressed out.
And yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we do a bunch of other things. This whole thing takes like 45 minutes. And then towards the end is where we start to reverse engineer all these things. And this is where where I touched on where it started when I was like 8 to 10. And we come up with basically this persona of where everything was birthed, which we call the little kid Damon. And so there's this little kid version of Damon that we kind of identified in that moment where all the good and all the bad started. And so being able to identify that and then going through the process of what came from that. And then we did this other session where it's almost like meditation where you just slow down and you're quiet, and she's kind of walking you through a narrative. And she's like, if you could go back, it's actually kind of what you said, like if you could go back and talk to who we call little kid Damon, what could you ask what he needs? And so this is what kind of started to unlock it was, and I always get emotional when I start like thinking about this, because it was such like an emotional moment where I go back and I'm like, okay, I can see this version of me. And it's this, we kind of stereotyped a certain time frame where it was probably 13 and I had long hair. I was a big skater kid. And like, that's like the persona that I remember most from that phase. And so you're having this dialogue in your head where it's like, okay, if I were talking to myself in that stage with who I am now, and you ask yourself in that moment, what do you need? And the reply that kept coming back was, I just want to play.
That hurts my heart. I've got little boys.
Yeah. And so it's like there's this moment that's when you start to realize where it's like, geez, I've had to balance a lot of for a long time. And from that is where we start to unfold everything and go, okay, where did everything come from? And, you know, where did this constantness come from? And then how do we give that version of you peace of mind? Because at the end of the day, that's usually what all of us struggle with, is some sort of thing that happened as a kid, whether you're super manly or not, like you got problems. And they're usually most of the people suffer because they don't acknowledge it. And even if they do acknowledge it, they don't go and try and attempt to resolve it. And so in that moment, it's like, oh, okay, well, what do I need to do to give that version of me peace of mind? And what was interesting and kind of unexpected is we did a session or two like this over the weeks that followed. And I basically just had to tell myself, like, hey, you're good now. Like, all the problems are gone, and, you know, you're stable. And all the things that you couldn't control no longer exist. And all the things you could control, you've taken care of. And just that just reset so much in my life. And I wasn't a depressed person. I've never categorized myself as depressed, but the amount of relief that comes from that, even not being depressed, was very tangible.
And I mean, that I will never forget you saying, I just want to play, right? I just want to play. And I think one of my biggest drivers for getting you on here and talking, and thank you for being so candid and transparent about, I just want to play, is I think sometimes there's this idea that people hit success easily. Right time, right place, right connections, right? Like that they've just always had this easier road. And I knew that your road hadn't been easy, but I don't think I realized just how much work you've put in. Do you ever think that people don't see how much you've done?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, it's an interesting balance where it's like, you don't need to give attention to past dramas once you've resolved them. So it's not like I'm out like I'm very open to what I've been through. Obviously I wouldn't be here, but I post about it and things like that too, but I don't evangelize it. The
Mhm.
when I talk about it is when I can tie it into something current. So it's like, hey, there's this cool thing I did, but here's where I came from. But I'm never just ranting about the I went through. I always turn it into a positive. But one of the things is that I'm trying to do better at is like slow down and give myself credit, because out of all the things that I do, like as soon as it's done, I just move on to the next thing. And I never just pause even for a microsecond to go, that was a big deal. Or like the charity, like we took months to organize it, spent like 15 grand out of my pocket and gave a bunch of kids cool toys. And like the night was over and I'm like, all right, like the end, you
The
know?
end.
And
Well, and I
so,
texted you after it. I texted you and was like, "How did it go? How did all this happen?" And I could see that it was like, yeah, it happened and I observed these things and it's like, wow, how do we slow down and celebrate not only the cool toys and the 50 kids, but also that you did it with your wife who adores you, right? And a marriage that you've built and that you guys have had this common thing. Like that's miraculous considering where you came from, right?
yeah, I think that's one thing. Pretty much everybody that finds success, there's something that gets sacrificed, and I think that's for me what it is the personal attention. Like I've lost for as confident as I am in myself and who I am, and compared to the general population, I feel like I'm more in tune with myself. I
Yeah.
still feel so lost. And so I think that's the part that was sacrificed in my entrepreneurship journey. And I bring that up because that's, you're talking about acknowledging those things. And I think that's part of what's been lost as well, is because it's just what's next, what's next, what's next.
Wow. So as you think about your journey, and I loved when you said, wow, I started here and I'm like clear over here now, right? As far as stability and a marriage and, trying to plan one-on-one time with my kids and charity work and all those kinds of things. I think so many entrepreneurs, myself included, struggle to understand the gap, what you were talking about, that you're constantly trying to unravel what that gap was and how you
Hmm.
journeyed through it so you can verbalize it and help and do all those things. So let me ask you this question about the gap. I think that there's a word that's thrown around a lot when people are dealing with trauma or their past or any kind of issues that we have. And the word that we use is called process, right? Like I've processed it or I've whatever. And you've talked about therapy, you've talked about the tapping dudes or whatever. Everybody Google what that is or whatever. But but I want to dive more into your brain on your daily processing. How do you daily process the stuff that you're facing? Or how do you daily process, like you said, I'm constantly looking for the next thing to crack or the next thing that's holding me back or whatever that is. So, what do you do? What does processing look like to you?
Mm. I probably don't have as sexy as an answer as you're
I don't think it's
expecting.
sexy. I really
It,
don't. Yeah. And
it's
so we
just
avoid it. We don't know what it is.
for me. It's always just the constant momentum. So it's like what that's how I've always been, and now I'm just aware of it, and so I'm being more selective about what I apply the constant momentum to, because even though I acknowledged the constant momentum as a stress in the last year or two, it's also super powerful. And so I don't want to get rid of it. I just have to be more aware of where I apply that attention to. And so now I've just been eliminating. And part of that's on business, part of that's personal. Like on business, it's, I hired a COO 2 years ago, and I'm continuing to give him more and more. But now, as we continue to grow, the time and availability that he's relieved for me, now he's running into the same problem, and I'm still running into it, just for different reasons now. And so now it's like, okay, well, we need to hire executive assistants. Like, there's just no way around it. So I'm trying to just be way more transparent with things about what the reality is of how to solve them, and in a quick fashion. And even in the personal side, like, I'll give you an example. Everybody always has to-dos around the house. And so it's like, I built half pipes in my backyard for my kids 2 years ago, and they needed new screws. And so it's like, well, that's not an immediate urgency, but it also can't sit forever. I want to get it done before summer. And then it was like going into fall. And then there's right out my window where I'm at, I have my kids' tree house that I built a couple of years ago, and I needed to change a Trex decking on it. So there's like literally a dozen things like that. None of them take more than like an hour or two, but collectively they take like a week.
Right.
And I just don't have any time for that. And so finally I just hired a repair guy. I'm like, hey, I got like 12 different random things, and they're going to take like a whole day. So can I pay you for a whole day? And so I'm just starting to just identify the things and go, just how the hell do I just get it off my list? And one thing that's been super new for me is on getting things off the list is I'm going to try and think of the right word, not analytical. I'm very literal on my to-do list. And so like if something comes in my head, it's like, can I do that? Yes. Okay, catalog it. And so I have a task management program that I use on my phone, and it's like, I never let anything go, but I'm very clear about, can I do it tomorrow or can I do it in 3 weeks? And so I'll schedule it accordingly.
Okay.
But that just adds up and adds up and adds up. So finally in the last like month, I'm like, this is just unsustainable. So what really matters? And so I'm just starting to delete stuff. And so I feel like my current priority is I'm just at max capacity of attention. And I just need to, by process of elimination, go, okay, I maybe don't not want to do that thing. I just can't. And that's the reality of it.
I just can't. This is such an interesting concept, especially when you say I'm really, really logical and I have all these lists, but you have this huge drive emotionally, right? To be generous, to give, to do these things, to have a marriage and those kinds of things. So what does that look like to combine your logical brain and also prioritize? Like, from what I can tell with your wife, you guys have got a great marriage. Why? Is that on your list? Like, what does that look like?
It's not on my list, but it is a priority above the list. And so that's just non-negotiable. So there are things that they are such clear non-negotiables that they don't even need a list. It's just always yes. And so like last night's a great example. And so I get off, so I work at home, I get off, and there's not a break, right? It's work all day, 5 o'clock hits. I don't even get a foot out the door before the kids go, oh, it's 5 and dad's off. And I see him open the door, dad. And so it's like last night I was at my wit's end. And so even though it's non-negotiable and it's something I'm grateful for, there's still a reality that it's overwhelming. Yeah. And so like last night I just go, I need 5 seconds. Because it's my one kid wants to go sledding. My daughter wants me to hang this hook in her room because she does like the silk aerial acrobatics. And so we got the silk downstairs, and now she wants it in her bedroom. And so like all my kids want something immediately. And then my wife's like, I can't get this video to play on the computer. Can you show me? I'm like, babe, I already promised them, and them. So you're going to have to wait. And so last night was just like perfect example. But at the same time, I told them all yes. And so if I say yes, it's a yes. And so and I'll be very transparent. Like, I think these are great learning lessons for the kids too, because my daughter wants me to hang this hook and my one son wants to go sledding. And so he had already asked to go sledding earlier in the day. She wasn't aware of it. She caught me first out the door after work and said, can I hang this hook? And I said, yes, but I promised him we'd go sledding first.
Mm.
And so it's good to help them understand, like, yeah, it's still a yes, but there's other things that go on that we have to kind of adjust for. And so I'm in my room with just my wife, not in front of the kids. And I'm like, I don't want to go. I'm like putting on my sweats, doubling up my socks. I'm like, it sucks. And then I walk out and I put a smile on. I'm like, all right, let's go. And it ended up being one of the funnest times we'd ever been sledding. Like, I was dead set on not going. I was so fixated on not going that I even told my son, I said, let's drive over there and see if there's even any snow. And while I'm driving over there, I'm like, oh, please don't be snow. Please don't be snow. Please melt. Please melt. And we get there and there's snow and it's like hard and crusty and nasty. And I'm like, dude, this is going to suck. But there's snow. I'm like, okay, we'll go. So we go back and that's when as I'm getting dressed. And then as we walk out the door, I already told my wife I'd look at her computer later. And she's like, hey, here's the computer. And I'm like, babe, I'll look at it when we get back from sledding. And I just walked out the door. And so we went sledding. And even though I committed to going, I swore we'd be there for 15 minutes. And I'm looking for like every excuse to get out once we get there. But I also want to be long enough that they don't think dad's a and we only went for a minute. We ended up staying for like an hour and a half, and it was so much fun. And then I came back and I just felt better and it was just great. And the kids were laughing and it was like 20. I'm like, it's cold. The snow sucks. It's not good for sledding. It's 20 degrees. It's freezing. And it ended up being awesome. So I don't know. I'm rambling here. So to come back, like my family always gets priority availability. So on my calendar, you can't get on before 9 a.m. because the kids are going to wake up 7, 8. I'm going to take them to school. And then you can't get on after 4:30. And because after 5, I check out. But then you also can't get on between 3 and 4. So you only got like this 4 to 4:30 window in the evenings because that's when my kids get home from school is during the 3 o'clock hour. So I'm always block that off so I can go and say hi. And so, I very rarely, if ever, work weekends, same with nights. And so like those are in my head, I don't even think about it because that's just the way I've determined it to be. And so I don't even consider it otherwise.
So I have two more questions for you based on some of the things that you've brought up. And I just hope that so many more people can see, the mix of world 1, world 2, right? Like started here, ended here, and just the living and breathing process of becoming someone that you're proud of. And my first question is centered again around this concept of peace, right? Because it seems that motivated you as a child in ways that were, I have to survive, right? And how can I keep the peace and lower the violence? And can I just be more quiet? That was a motivator. And now it's turned into this very abundant definition of peace on how can I live with myself? How can I be proud of myself? And how can I, be proud of my hour and a half sledding? That's a long time. We went sledding yesterday too, and it was freezing. But I do live in Logan, so that's a little bit different. But anyway, so this whole idea of peace, and I think there's this book that I've been reading that's called Drama Free, that's about problems that seemingly normal families have, right? And how to navigate those things. And she really, really pushes against the idea that blood is thicker than water, right? She fights against that idea that it is family at all cost. And I think she's before her time in that way, in calling that out, that you don't let family run rampant all over you and do all this kind of stuff. And how do we do this? And so my question is do you live with any kind of guilt or coulda, shoulda, woulda, or I wish my mom was more present in my kid's life and I'll continue to send her soccer schedules and do all those things, but I can't control what she does. But like, how do you disconnect that? Like, doesn't everybody want a grandma that's involved? Doesn't everybody want that?
Well, no, I don't have a problem with that at all. And yeah, the idea of that sounds romantic, but I'm also a realist. And so in my circumstance, that's not reality. And so there is zero service for yourself in trying to believe otherwise. And so, my wife struggles with that. She'll make comments that she wishes my mom was more involved. But for me, the truth is the truth. And so if that's what the reality is, there's no point in giving attention to hypotheticals.
So it is hard for your wife.
Yeah, yeah. She's very opposite than I am in many ways. And she's like I'm very logical, she's very emotional. And so the logical side of me is, well, she's always been that way. I've made efforts. I've made more efforts, and that's clearly not going to change. If anything, the patterns have just been reinforced. And so that type of toxicity does no good in my life, and it wouldn't do any good in my kids' lives to pursue and introduce it. And
Mm.
but so I mean the door's open, but I'm not going to invite.
So have you read the 10X book?
Yes, but I suck at remembering
Okay,
details
okay.
of books and movies.
Okay, well, there's a concept in here that I think leads into what you're saying. I'm trying to find like 10X is easier than 2X or something like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Ben Hardy's book.
Ben
Yeah.
Hardy.
Yeah.
And there he has an entire chapter devoted around don't apologize for what you want. Like
Yeah.
what you want, don't apologize for it. And I've noticed from responses from your mother about you being a millionaire, right? I've noticed that you've gotten grumblings for putting in a pool in your home and
Hmm.
comments, all these kinds of things. I also think that you're trying to teach your kids really good values. Witness that, read about that, that you're trying to teach your kids good things. So, how do you find that balance as a parent in talking to your kids about, are you better than anyone else? Are you not better than anyone else? Like going after what you want, but what if that hurts people's feelings for going after what you want? Like, what's that experience been like for you in not allowing comments about being an effing millionaire to make you shrink? Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, so I've gotten very comfortable with these things, even these types of topics. That doesn't mean it's easy. Like it's still awkward for
Right.
me, but I've come to realize that the truth is more important than the awkwardness. And so I teach my kids the same thing. Now, I don't teach them, you know, the concept of participation trophies, but I think you can also teach your kids to pursue greatness. And it's not a zero sum thing. Just because they're pursuing greatness doesn't mean anybody's lesser than them. So I think you can do both. Like, it's not like, hey, you're the best at the thing, so everybody else sucks. No, it's like, hey, you're the best at the other thing. And that's because you worked hard. And so it doesn't have to be a comparison thing. And I think this comes back to the previous topic of, logical and being a realist. And I mean, the truth is the truth. And so I think one of the best things that I've ever done for my kids and still do, and now that they're getting old enough, that they're starting to be able to make logical comparisons of family households and the relationship that they have with me and their mom versus the relationship that their friends have with their parents. And
Yes.
I'll give you a funny example here in a minute.
Yes, please.
But now that I've planted those seeds long enough and I'm starting to see them kind of bear fruit, is the best thing is just ultimate transparency and honesty. And so, like, I'll go out and now you also have to gauge the level of what you expose them to. So it's not like I'm going to go out of my way and expose them something just because it's the truth. That's something that's ahead of their, few years too early.
Yeah.
But if it makes sense for the age that they're at, I am wildly transparent. Like, so I have a 13-year-old son, and when I was just waiting to find out when fifth grade maturation was, and I'm like, that the classes are worthless, they don't go into proper detail, they're not honest. And so I was like, that's not how he's going to learn. So when I found out when it was, the weekend before, me and him did a one-on-one trip to Park City. We went and played all day and did cool stuff. And I told him what was coming. I said, we're going to go hang out during the day. And then at the night, we're going to talk about your maturation classes coming up. I told him everything, right? I'm like, here's how sex works. Me and your mom do it. You're going to want to touch yourself, like everything.
Yeah.
Because that, especially those things like confidence and sex and like all the taboo things that everybody's awkward about are the most important things you need to talk to your kids about because
Right.
they're not going to go away. And
Mm.
so would you rather defer it and then cross your fingers and hope they never hear about it and learn on their own? Well, that's not a good option. Or you're going to cross your fingers and hope somebody else tells them. And then what if they tell them inaccurately? And if you think about like a lot of the problems that you have growing up is a lot of those are usually miscommunications or lack of communications on topics from your parents, especially in the world of like, intimacy and relationships and things like that. What's taboo and what's appropriate and like just anyways. So the other day when my son, before he was born, we knew what his name was going to be. And so my wife and I would go to this big event in Las Vegas called SEMA, and it's a big car convention. And we'd go there, and then we had this great idea where we're like, let's have, so there's like these attractive models at the different booths. And we said, let's have them write posters to our kids. And so we had all these poster signs and we played along. We're like, we don't have any kids yet. Here's what his name's going to be. And then when we had kids, we're like, he's 2, here's his name. And they would write on these posters and they'd say things like, can't wait till you're 18. Age is just a number, and like all these funny things. And so now that he's a teenager, I'm like, look, he's into girls. If he's not, he's going to be any moment. So like, what better time to go, look, me and your mom have been thinking about you since before you were born. And so that was fun to begin with, but to kind of come full circle back to like relationships and teaching your kids and what they see versus their friends' relationships is my son was understandably awkward with the posters because they're like all these women in like bikinis and lingerie. And I go, hey, you don't need to hang these up, right? Like I get that it's weird. I just thought it was cool that we've thought about you and we've been holding on to these for so long. And he goes, yeah, that is cool. And so he just kind of sheepishly walked away. Well, then fast forward to like 2 hours later, and he had friends over, and I went downstairs and I went to ask him something. And I opened the door and he's like, Dad, I'm showing them the posters. And so I'm like, did you tell him the story? And he's like, yeah, I told him how you've been hanging on to him since I was a baby. And then both of his friends were like, my parents would never. Oh. And they're talking about like how cool we are and that we did this thing and that there's girls and we weren't mad at it. And so, you can see when parents force, like you touched on earlier, repeat patterns, or they force their own insecurities on their kids based about their beliefs or things that they've been misguided on, or they try to relive and redirect themselves through their kids. And I think the best thing that you can do is just be radically transparent with them because the truth is the truth.
Oh, my word. And it sounds like you're already starting to see that that's not the norm, right?
Yeah.
It just is not the norm. And I think that there is like, what impact does a parent that is confident in the path they're taking have on a family? Life-changing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Life-changing. And I've just admired watching you and observing you and those lucky kids to get in there and say, I've got a parent that is transparent with me and that is open with me. And I just think, what a gift. What an absolute gift.
Yeah. Yeah, it's rewarding and it's cool when they start to get old enough and realize that themselves and start to mirror that back to you. Well, they'll send me messages and say, Dad, I just wanted to say thanks for you letting me do the things I do, or you letting me be the way I am and things like that.
Oh, that is so cool. And what would that have been like for you as a kid to hear that? Thanks for letting me be who I want to be.
Well, my mom wasn't a bad person, right? I think she made poor choices that manifested poor circumstances.
Yeah.
She was generally well-loving and she was never, there was probably opportunities to be more supportive, but she was never intentionally unsupportive. Mm-hmm. So I don't feel like I was ever neglected or misdirected on what my possibilities were. There was probably gaps in, encouragement in certain times, but I never felt like there was neglect on, you can't do this or you're not that person,
Oh, well, I just love your transparency. I love your graciousness to your mom and also your transparency about where you came from. I think that's hugely valuable. So just as a very last thought for those who are listening, who are really, really interested in how, their growing up is impacting their own success, what would be your starting line for them on allowing people to expose the truth about the things that are holding them back from where they want to be?
It's going to be the simplest and the most complex answer all at the same time.
Please.
So The simple reality is you have to get stuff off your chest. Like, you have to be honest. You have to be honest with yourself. You can't be honest externally until you're honest with yourself. And so too many times we're not realistic with ourselves. And so you may not hype yourself up unnecessarily, but you may not be real with yourself about the circumstances you're in. You got to fix your own first. And so once you at least know the path you're heading in, or at least know the issues you're trying to solve, then be radically transparent with what you need to support that. Like, I actually just sent a text or an email today. So there's somebody that's been in my life a couple years, came in kind of as a friend through a friend, got a little bit of wounded bird syndrome where I wanted to help them out. And I let them in more than I usually do on the communication frequency. And now I'm undoing that. And I just had to send him another message today. I'm like, dude, I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm just going to repeat this again. I just can't have this in my life. And so that's not fun. I know I'm hurting people's feelings, but what justice is it going to do to yourself to keep other people's stuff weighing you down? And so you can't be great and do the things that you're great at while you're always diluting yourself across everybody else. So you have to get real transparent on what you want to do, personal, business, whatever, and then eliminate everything else outside of that. It is a super simple concept, just eliminate noise. It is hard to do, but it's worth it.
And I love that your first step is to be transparent about it. What actually needs to be eliminated. So valuable. So valuable. Yeah. Well, Damon, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your stories, for your transparency, and also for just shining a light on what is possible. And I know that sounds like a really generic statement, but gosh, someone who's generous, someone who's transparent, someone who's an engaged father, someone who's unafraid of the maturation program. I mean, it's all the things, right? It's all the things that we're aiming to be. So I so appreciate you taking the time to be here and talking about your journey, and also being willing to say, I'm figured out 50% of this. And this is what I know so far. And it'll be fun to continue to watch your journey as you unravel your story, and just really, really grateful for your time. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to the Unreasonable Autonomy podcast. If you loved this episode, my guests and I would love to hear about it. Go to the show notes to reach out and let me know what resonated with you, or what topics or guests you want to hear in the future. I am here to create for you. Look, I deeply admire your commitment to pushing boundaries and going after an unreasonable life. Keep dreaming big, taking bold steps, and expecting the unreasonable. For more, go to the show notes to dive deeper into the conversations that will keep you going. Thanks for being here.